Good morning, and thank you all for joining us today, especially the survivors in our audience. I'm Dina Hirsch, Vice President of the Generations After. And first, a scheduling note. We will host our annual meeting and elections following the conclusion of this program at approximately 12:15. And we ask all Generation After members to stay with us for that. Thank you. In June, we conducted an interest survey with our members and other interested individuals. The results clearly revealed that anti-Semitism, the world's oldest hatred, was the topic of greatest interest. This mirrored the results of our 2019 survey. Today's program reflects the importance of this topic to our community. In October 2011, Elie Wiesel posed this question in a speech in Oakhurst, New Jersey. If Auschwitz hasn't cured the world of anti-Semitism, what can and what will? Unfortunately, we don't know how to eradicate it. Will the world ever learn? It will not, because it hasn't. Sadly, his words still ring hauntingly true. We're privileged today to have two outstanding speakers with us, Mark Weitzman and Jonah Cohen, to explore the history of anti-Semitism as well as approaches that we as individuals can use to combat this scourge. Please note that we will have a Q&A session at the end of the program, and we invite you to write your questions in the chat as we go along. Our first speaker, Mark Weitzman, will give us a brief history of anti-Semitism. Mark is Chief Operating Officer of the World Jewish Restitution Organization. He previously served as Director of Government Affairs for the Simon Wiesenthal Center. He's a member of the official U.S. delegation to the International Holocaust Remembrance Authority, IHRA, where he chaired the Committee on Anti-Semitism and Holocaust Denial and the Working Group on Holocaust Museums and Memorials. Mark spearheaded IHRA's 2016 adoption of the working definition of anti-Semitism. He was also the lead author of IHRA's working definition of Holocaust denial and distortion, which was adopted by IHRA in 2013. Mark won the 2007 National Jewish Book Award for Best Anthology for Anti-Semitism, the Generic Hatred Essays in Memory of Simon Wiesenthal. Please welcome Mark Weitzman.
Thank you very much, Dina, and thank you for the invitation. And really, thank you everyone for the work you do in keeping the memory alive. No one knows more than the people gathered here what anti-Semitism, how it can affect people, and its impact and its toll, certainly on the Jewish world and on humanity in general. There are many different types of hate that are all equally pernicious in many ways and dangerous. Yet anti-Semitism is unique, and as you mentioned, Dina, in the phrase coined by my late friend Robert Wistrich, the longest hatred. It goes back in antiquity, and even we could say to the biblical times. And yet it is present today. It is pervasive today in many areas, and its danger. Yehuda Bauer, the eminent scholar of anti-Semitism in Israel and Jerusalem, has pointed out that the ideology of anti-Semitism was the motivating factor behind World War II, behind the Nazi aggression and genocide that killed over 20 million civilians, the largest death toll in human history. To begin to understand that, I'm going to try to take you on a really brief pictorial survey through the history of anti-Semitism. It's going to be very brief. We're going to be skimming over a lot of things, but I just really hope to give you kind of an overview of what we view as anti-Semitism and its impact and how it plays out today. So I'm going to skip the biblical period, and even though there are instances there of planned genocide, perhaps back in the days of the pharaohs in Egypt, but we're going to begin with the beginning of Christianity. And for Christianity, having been born out of a Jewish sect or an inter-Jewish squabble between Jesus' followers, who all initially conceived of themselves as part of Jews, there was the necessity later on for the church to develop an ideology and a theology that separated itself, made itself distinctive from its Jewish origins. And they did that. You have the words of Pope Innocent the Third there, which I put up on the screen. Thank you. And it sort of sums up this whole ideology by saying that the Jews, by their own guilt, in other words, Jews were guilty of the crime of deicide, they're consigned to perpetual servitude, and they are damned internally to wander the earth, at least until they accept the second coming of Jesus. This set up a typology where it was good triumphant church versus corrupt and evil Jews who were condemned to servitude. If we go to the next slide, we see that acting out in the next slide, please. We see that acting out in different ways. The poisoning of the wells in the 14th century had showed, again, the figure of Christ now being linked to the plagues that were going around and putting Jews together. It's not only did they kill Jesus in the past, but they're now responsible for the plagues and the mass death going on in the 14th century. And as a result, we see the beginnings of violence against Jews on an unprecedented level, the burnings of Jews, for example, in the illustration that you see next to it. The next slide illustrates a very strong, colorful visual depiction in a church in Germany of the attitudes. And you see on the one in the white on the left side of the photo, you see the church triumphant with an upheld banner and looking vigorous and strong and the inheritor of all of God's promises at this point. While next to it is the synagogue, broken, staff broken, bowed, blinded. And these became two typological figures. Ecclesia, the church, triumphant, and synagoga, the synagogue broken. And if you go to many places throughout Europe, very famously in the Strasbourg Cathedral that's still there, and if you recall a couple of summers ago, there was a disastrous fire in Notre Dame in Paris. There was still above one of the lintels in Notre Dame this same kind of imagery that shows the triumphant church by virtue of its inheriting all of God's promises, and the wicked and broken synagogue Jewish people downtrodden. And there's Strasbourg. As I mentioned, the Catholic world, Christendom was rent, in the 16th century by Martin Luther. Luther began reaching out to the Jewish community in Germany, and he hoped that they would join him by Luther's attempted return to the bare bones Bible of the original, what they would have called the Old Testament, we call the Hebrew Bible, with its commandments and admonitions against adornment or synagogues or images to be worshipped and so on. Luther thought that there would be sympathy in the Jewish community, that he could get them to win them over and have them join him in his crusade against the Catholic Church. They would become good Lutheran Christians because it spoke to them in his mind. When Jews rejected that and kept their own identity, toward the end of his life, the last few years, he turned on them bitterly. And he published an infamous tract called On the Jews and Their Lies, 1543, just a few years before his death. And you see in there just an incredible foreshadowing. And we want to be very careful because it's not a straight line from Luther to Nazi Germany necessarily. But nonetheless, the fact that this was in Germany was really fascinating and scary, that synagogues and schools should be set on fire, prayer books destroyed. You can read it for yourselves. And it's a whole list of things there that really did come true, unfortunately, 500 years later, 400 years later. And these two strands of Christianity, both the Catholic Church and the Lutheran Protestant Church, shared a great deal of responsibility for not rejecting it. There were, to be fair, there were always people in the church who defended Jews. Otherwise, we probably would not have survived when the church had temporal power, had that secular power, when Christendom did. But nonetheless, this created a overall overwhelming approach that saw Christianity as the positive and Jews as the negative in Western civilization. This situation persisted until the Enlightenment, which was an attack on the values, particularly the Catholic Church. And it was supposed to be scientific, rationalist. Voltaire was one of the leading proponents of the Enlightenment. And again, these are examples. These figures I picked out are sort of examples. They're leading figures in different movements but they're examples to illustrate what was going on because of their influence and importance. So Voltaire is considered one of the fathers of the Enlightenment, and you would have thought that because they was attacking the superstition of the church and Christendom and so on, would have been sympathetic to Jews. But the reality was, because he viewed the Hebrew Bible as being the font, the origins of Christianity, his venom and attack went from Christianity to its source, as he saw it, which was the Hebrew Bible, and the superstitious religion, not just of the Catholic Church particularly, but they inherited that, in his view, from the synagogue, from the church, from the synagogue, from the Jewish community, and Jewish religion. And so you see that even in Voltaire, the supposedly enlightened critic of religious establishment at the time, Christian religious establishment, you see a series of both racist and anti-Semitic comments that he had no problem putting out publicly. And that, again, certainly he was not the only one in the Enlightenment who spoke, and some that did were, philo Jewish or friends of Jews. But Voltaire certainly had an important strand of anti-Semitism that permeated the Enlightenment, and that continues to play out as we go. And Europe becomes more secular and less religious, and religious authority doesn't translate, except for Italy perhaps, into secular power. It continues. We see that now we have the entry of science into it, or pseudoscience. In the wake of Charles Darwin and the whole theory of evolution and of human races, there became a pseudoscience of racial science. And that, for example, this Frenchman, de Jobineau, put out a pamphlet in 1854 where he began creating, and he was not the only one, a taxonomy of races, ranking races from top to bottom, best to worst. And he put the so-called Aryan race on top, and toward the bottom were Jews. People of color were less than human in many ways. And he continued the same kind of religious typology of good Christian or good Aryan versus bad Jew, but he put it in the terms of the newly popular or growing scientific terms of that time, especially social Darwinism, which saw the whole social structure as a battle, competition between the races for survival. If we continue to the next one. And by the way, and you can see that we're beginning to get into familiar grounds here. This is leading in the 19th century already. It's leading into so-called modern times. The term anti-Semitism is generally, I don't know, is credited the right word here, to a German publicist, journalist named Wilhelm Marr, who published this in 1879. He put it in. It was used earlier than that, but Marr is the person who actually publicized it and is given most credit for it. And Marr's idea was he wanted to break away from the rabble-rousing street anti-Judaism of the time. He didn't want it to be, the kind of the stones on the ground. He wanted it to be a more intellectual and highly political, powerful force. There were the creation of anti-Semitic parties in Germany, in Austria, and Vienna had an anti-Semitic mayor named Karl Lueger. And what Marr wanted to do was link it to the scientific thinking of the time. So as I mentioned earlier, there was taxonomy of races. There was the Aryan race on top. He looked for a term for the Jewish race, so to speak, and he came up with the term Semites. And thus was born the anti-Semitic parties, the anti-Semitic ideology that Marr tried to publicize and popularize. Interestingly enough, by the way, toward the end of his life, Marr reversed course, and actually became much more philo-Semitic, and ended up, I think, somewhat regretting the role that he had played initially. So we have now various strands. We have the strand of still the church thinking, and in the 19th century and early 20th century, the Catholic Church continued to promulgate anti-Semitism at a very high level, blood libel and things like that in Jesuit publications and church publications all over. You have the scientific or pseudoscientific aspects of racial science. You have the Enlightenment, the literary and philosophical approach of Voltaire and the Enlightenment. And now you add to that the conspiratorial aspect embodied by the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which originally came out at the end of the 19th century. They were based on a sort of Ukrainian-Russian forgery that they took elements of an anti-Napoleon III political satire that a French writer had published, plagiarized it shamelessly, and produced a document that claimed to tell the story of a plot of Jewish elders to control the Western world. And it was immensely popular, and it still is immensely popular. I'm sure you've heard of the protocols. Some of the elements of the ongoing Kyrie Irving saga reflect thinking of the same kind of conspiratorial thinking of the protocols. We'll get to some of those more modern manifestations or occurrence in a few minutes, but it is just a sample of different publications of it, including the German one in the brown cover. And the protocols basically, even though they were debunked in 1926 in a series of influential columns, pieces by the journalist Philip Graves in the Times of London, nonetheless grabbed hold and had a huge impact. And if you want to call it the Bible of anti-Semitism, the foundational document of modern anti-Semitism, there's no question about it. They influenced Hitler, and they've been influencing anti-Semites ever since. And one of the people they influenced was Henry Ford, the master of technology, which, by the way, also has relevance today, because as we see with the Elon Musk, the fear, for example, that the ability to produce a product for mass consumption has no relationship to understanding the dangers of anti-Semitism or other forms of race or extremism. Ford industrialized and popularized anti-Semitism in America. His newspaper, the Dearborn Independent, published a series of tracts called the International Jew, in which he really brought anti-Semitism into a major focus. Now, by the way, I have to point out here, anti-Semitism in America existed from its origins. I'm speaking these words from New York, and we know that Peter Stuyvesant, the most pivotal figure in the founding of New York City, New York State, etc., wanted to bar Jews from entering when it was still a Dutch colony. He had to be overruled by his bosses. Stuyvesant, who was a racist slaver as well, had some flat-out anti-Semitic remarks about not wanting the malignant presence of Jews to infiltrate and destroy the new colony. And this was something that maybe was a bit of a pattern, in that there was that anti-Semitism of Stuyvesant. He was overruled by his bosses, and I think that's one of the things that allowed anti-Semitism, even though it was always present on American soil, never to take root the same way that it did in Europe. We never had really the state-sanctioned anti-Semitism, the mass violence. Even when Grant issued his order trying to expel Jews, it was overruled almost immediately. And Grant later apologized and was had a good record on the issue. And we did have, obviously, through the 20th century, the polite, genteel anti-Semitism of quotas that barred Jews from elite universities, from professions, and so on and so forth. But it was nothing comparable to the levels that existed in Europe as we went on. But Ford did bring it to the U.S., and there were elements of Ford that Ford introduced to America that helped seed not just the genteel anti-Semitism, but the extremist anti-Semitism that flourished in the neo-Nazi movements in the 1980s and have their impact going forward today. And I should point out parenthetically that a bust of Henry Ford, who was one of Hitler's idols, was kept on Hitler's desk in his room. Again, very specifically, I want to make it clear, Ford's descendants repudiated that immediately, directly, impactfully, forcefully, and there is no connection between the Ford Motor Company or any of Henry Ford's descendants and their ancestors' poisonous beliefs. And as you probably know, Ford was forced to apologize and back down after the publication of these things. I took this illustration, and we're going to see a couple of slides. This is from a Nazi children's book, German Nazi children's book called The Poison Mushroom. You see the stereotype. Jews are the poisonous mushroom that can poison society. And the reason I did it because I want to show you here how all these strands came together. So, for example, clearly you see the cross. Even though the Nazis had at best an ambivalent relationship with Christianity, set up their own opposing forms of Christianity to the established church, but had a lot of sympathy and a lot of support in many ways. But nonetheless, there is the traditional religious anti-Semitism of Christianity used by the Nazis. And here the Jewish nose is bent. So again, the racial, the physiognomy race, the idea that Jews have different features, they're coarse, They're not as good looking as the superior Aryans. And here, the conspiracy that Jews are only interested in money. The concept was the Nazis used the term Judeo-Bolshevik, saying that Jews were both interested in money and communist supporters at the same time, which is, again, we see that in certain conspiratorial comments that are being uttered today in different parts of the world. A little bit sort of plays out with the whole George Soros stereotype. And again, I want to be very clear. George Soros is someone that we could disagree with. I disagree with him strongly on some of his positions, but Israel, Zionism, and so on and so forth. But to allege that George Soros is a figure that is behind a massive global plot, a conspiracy for money, and so on, and those kind of things, it ties into these kind of stereotypes. Soros is today's Rothschilds, and the plutocrats, the bankers of today. Again, we see it in some of the New World Order comments, comes out in this stereotype from the Nazi period as well. And it resembled, if you may recall, one of the illustrations, one of the covers of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion that we showed earlier. So today, what has changed today is all those past ones led up to World War II, led up to the Holocaust. They were all there, and they still are there. The Holocaust certainly changed it in a way by marginalizing elements of anti-Semitism, taking it out of popular discourse, public discourse, making it unacceptable on an official level. It also, as we know, was followed in 1948 by the creation of the State of Israel. And anti-Semitism thus can be channeled safely into opposition against Israel. And again, I'll repeat it over and over again, criticizing Israeli policy or so on is not anti-Semitic necessarily. Criticizing and delegitimizing the existence of the State of Israel is, I believe, anti-Semitic. And here you have people, and this is generally a more progressive, extreme left-wing trope of blaming or equating Zionism and Nazism, saying that Zionism is a current form of Nazism. Jews who suffered under the Nazis are doing to the Palestinians what the Nazis did to them, which is a totally misleading comparison and malicious one made with ill will, certainly. So again, now I'm going to skip it to a couple of forms. Holocaust denial was really marginalized in the famous Deborah Lipstadt, David Irving trial in 2000, where the historian Deborah Lipstadt won her battle against David Irving, who the infamous pseudo-British historian who was at that point had a sort of respectable career, but had veered into neo-Nazism and veered into Holocaust denial. And in an incredibly strong statement, the judge found that Irving, who had accused Lipstadt of libeling him, and when she called him a Holocaust denier and anti-Semite, had basically understated the case. That Irving, who was the neo-Nazi, hung out with anti-Semites, was a Holocaust denier, and so on and so forth. That pushed Holocaust denial out of any direct ability to influence the mainstream. But Holocaust distortion has become more and more popular and more prevalent and more powerful and more dangerous. Holocaust distortion doesn't deny that the Holocaust took place. But, for example, it raises the national, these are two people in Hungary who are been raised. The Albert Voss is a writer who's now in the Hungarian national curriculum. And you could see in the uniform of a collaborator. And he has written some anti-Semitic material. He died in the U.S. Never was really punished for his work. Balint Homan was a politician who introduced the Nuremberg laws, an historian, into Hungary. The Nuremberg laws, as you recall, were the ones that were used to disenfranchise Jews in Nazi Germany. He produced the Hungarian version. The Hungarian government tried to honor him, raised statues in his honor a few years ago. I worked together with the then special envoy on Holocaust and anti-Semitism, Ira Forman. We went to Budapest. The government finally backed down on it. But that was an attempt, in other words, to rehabilitate and honor former Nazi collaborators and anti-Semites. And Hungary is not the only place where that's happening. We see in Poland and Ukraine and other places laws that basically say that if you criticize or just actually portray history accurately in terms of the local collaborators, you can be accused of civil or criminal violations and punished by fines or initially, at least in Poland, by a jail term. This has been applied in different countries in Europe. In Poland, it's an ongoing issue, the distortion of the Holocaust. In Ukraine, it has, and obviously the circumstances, present circumstances have changed everything. This was a law that was enacted. It was never really acted upon. And clearly, it's been flipped on its head by Vladimir Putin's attempt to use the Holocaust as a justification for his aggression and invasion of Ukraine, which we totally repudiate and reject. Putin, as Russia, also passed a law that said that you, for example, a blogger who wrote accurately that Nazi Germany and Soviet Russia invaded Poland to start World War II, was actually found guilty and sentenced in Putin's Russia for telling the truth, speaking the history accurately. So we see that Holocaust distortion has reached a level of policy in different countries and has an impact on different countries. If we continue, please. And in Poland, this was a Polish historian, and I took her out. She's one of the most virulent anti-Semites in Poland. She's an academic. She's gotten government support. And the reason I put her in here was she actually came to the US. I helped expose this a few years ago to receive awards and honors that were initiated by the Polish consulate in different places. To their credit, the Polish Foreign Ministry, when they found out about it, pulled back and did not support that at all. But this is an example of the fact that it's not just limited to those countries, but they try to reach their internationally and have an impact and influence on other Western countries, such as the UK, United States, and so on, Canada. And I'm not even getting into the fact that there are memorials and statues and monuments to a lot of collaborators throughout a lot of Western countries and Canada and so on in the United States. I'll use as one quick example, Wernher von Braun, the Nazi scientist who helped create the US space program, had until a few months ago a statue in his honor in Huntsville, Alabama, at the NASA facility there. So it's mentioned that in 2013, we got the working IRA to adopt the working definition of Holocaust denial and distortion. That was about a 4 or 5 year process. And the reason was in IRA, there are over 30 countries, at that time 31 now, I think 35, 6. And everything IRA does officially is done by consensus, which in diplomatic terms means that every country has to sign off. If one country doesn't agree to it, it's blocked. So we had to get all 30 so odd countries to accept it. And these are countries that include Poland and Latvia and Lithuania and Hungary, Croatia. You get the idea. And the denial part was not difficult. The distortion part was immensely difficult. I give credit to the Canadian government and the Canadian chair at that time for helping me and really pushing it through. Without them, it would not have happened. And without that, because that took place 3 years before the anti-Semitism definition, if we were not successful with that, we would not have had an anti-Semitism definition because one flowed from the other. We could not have proceeded unless we did this as the first building block. And again, these definitions are meant as tools. We'll get to the anti-Semitism one in a minute as we head to the conclusion. But if we keep going, I'm not going to go into the text of this. I just want you to see it. It's available online and you can find it, or I can give you at the IHRA website, which is holocaustremembrance.org. A synagogue in Wuppertal, Germany, 2014, in the middle of another summer 2014, in the middle of another Mideast Gaza war with Israel. A synagogue rebuilt after Kristallnacht, it was destroyed, was firebombed. Top, you see the investigators. At the bottom, you see the Molotov cocktails. 2 men, Middle Eastern origin, were arrested, confessed to what they had done. For first one German court and then a second German appeals court ruled that it was not anti-Semitic, it was not a hate crime, it was an act of protected political speech because they were protesting what was happening in Gaza. This kind of thinking was part of the impetus behind the anti-Semitism definition. When you can have the firebombing of a synagogue with people who are thousands of miles away from anything happening and not participated in the Middle East, justified or protected, then there is a significant problem. To their credit, the German government was officially distraught over this and moved very strongly and helped take steps against it. And in Germany, again, as you probably know, the Länder, the states, have a lot of independence. There is no national, for example, curriculum. It's state by state, Länder by Länder. So a lot of these had to be handled on a case-by-case basis. But this was an example of what we realized we needed to move against. And in the US, perhaps the wake-up signal here was Charlottesville. Again, the Jews will not replace us is part of the Great Replacement Theory, which at least one congresswoman in Washington, Marjorie Taylor Greene, has latched onto. saying the idea is that Jews are behind the plot to flood Western countries, whether it's France where it originated or the United States, with people of color, migrants, and so on, who will lower the racial standards of the country and weaken the fabric of the country, and thus strengthen the Jewish presence, ability, or whatever you will on it. And blood and soil, the other chant there, was literally a Nazi soil, coined by Walter Darré, Hitler's Minister of Agriculture, and it meant the idea that blood, race was tied to the soil, and the German race, the Aryan race, needed the soil for its own purpose, and thus could expand, kind of linked to the Lebensraum concept, the idea of having more living room for the superior race, and using the inferior races as slaves or on the way to genocide. And Richard Spencer, founder of the alt-right, which is now morphed into different names and different groups, and Spencer, one of the organizers of Charlottesville, and here shortly after you could see giving a Nazi salute and being answered by his followers in a restaurant in Washington, which gives you the idea, just tells you where he's coming from and where the ideology was coming from. I mentioned Marjorie Taylor Greene before. I think it's really been a long time since we had anti-Semites in Congress. If you go back to the 1930s, it was clear there were anti-Semites in Congress, in the Senate, look at the congressional record, in the State Department. We all know that there were people, Breckinridge Long, for example, that helped close the doors to immigrants because of their anti-Semitism. And once again, in the halls of power, we have people who I would have to say are overt anti-Semites. Marjorie Taylor Greene is a case in point. She's not the only case in point. We can see, again, some of the way it's transmuted today is particularly Holocaust distortion, the idea that vaccination is a Jewish plot. You see anti-Semitic flyers that have been distributed recently on one side. On the other side, the use of the yellow star to say that a vaccine is the equivalent of Nazi measures of identifying and leading to genocide of those who don't want to be accept the vaccine. So a public health measure that's meant to save lives is turned into the equivalent of what the Nazis termed the final solution. And it's not on the extreme right only. We find it, as I mentioned earlier, on the extreme left and the progressive side. I just picked out a quote from Rashida Tlaib, one of the members of the Democratic Party, who's expressed anti-Semitic statements in the past and is continuing and was reelected and is continuing to hold her seat in Washington. So the IHRA working definition of anti-Semitism was adopted in 2016, and this is going to be the close of it. And the idea of the IHRA working definition was, I mentioned earlier, we had 30 representatives from over 30 countries. IHRA is the only international governmental body organization whose mandate is to deal specifically with the Holocaust, with anti-Semitism. It doesn't deal with economics or social work or, imports, export tariffs, or anything else. Just that. We realize we have people. The delegations are headed by government officials, senior diplomats, ambassador level or higher, and we're coming from all these countries. I mentioned some earlier, the countries where the Shoah, the Holocaust, took place, as well as countries like Israel, the United States, Canada, Australia, Argentina, and we're sitting around a table, and we realized we didn't have everybody, and they also include not just diplomats, but academics and researchers and museums, Holocaust museums, memorial staff, educators, Jewish communal officials, representatives. We wanted to make sure that everybody knew what we were talking about when we were using these terms. And so we began to develop these definitions for our own purposes as a working tool. And that's one of the reasons why it's called a working definition. Both of them are called working definitions, not because it's meant that they are in progress. They're not being revisited, but it's meant because they were meant as a practical working tool, a tool to work with. And they're not academic definitions. I know some academics are up in arms because it doesn't suit their purposes. If you look at academic definitions, and I've studied them, believe me, they're usually a lot wordier, a lot more dense, and very difficult. This was meant for the judge, the police official, the educator, someone who needs to see if something is anti-Semitic and have an ability to judge it. So, for example, when President Trump signed the executive order saying that the Department of Education would use the IHRA definition as a tool, he didn't mean that, and that didn't mean that the entire government would use it in this case. It didn't mean that someone would be put in jail because of something that they said that was contrary to the IRA definition. It meant if someone made a complaint on a campus, a student, a professor, whatever, that there was an instance of anti-Semitism, how do you evaluate whether that was legitimately anti-Semitic or not? Because if it is anti-Semitic, then it falls into a different, more protected category. If it isn't, it falls into a more general category. How do you make that evaluation? You need a tool, you need a metric. That's what the IRA working definition of anti-Semitism is. It's been adopted by the State Department, by over 35 countries, thousands of cities and institutions across the country. I know Montgomery County had its own adoption just last week. And because of its success, it's come under a lot of pressure and criticism from people, particularly on the left progressive side, who really wanted to get rid of it, because the difference between this and other definitions of anti-Semitism is we looked at examples, we put examples in there, and it's not limited to those examples, but we put examples in that refer to anti-Semitism directed through Israel or about Israel. And if you want to delegitimize Israel, if you want to destroy Israel, if you want to target Zionists, this definition is a problem for you, and its acceptance is a problem. If not, you shouldn't have a problem with it. It's legally non-binding. You can see it says that, which means that, again, it's not meant to put anybody in jail. You can't violate IRA. It's not a legal code. And we say very specifically that context matters. Something can be anti-Semitic used in an anti-Semitic way that's not necessarily generically or inherently anti-Semitic. We also say that criticism of the state of Israel is only anti-Semitic if it's meant to delegitimize or destroy the state of Israel. You can see the languages in there. I'm not sure if it's in this one or not. Criticism of the state of Israel, similar to that level against any other country, cannot be termed anti-Semitic. But if you cross and use a double standard or call for the delegitimization or destruction of the state of Israel, that is going to anti-Semitic territory. So we have all these strictures and hedges in there. We say that, again, that the law of each country is what's applicable in this case. See how there's the claim made it's used to silence opposition to Israel. That's just a lie, and that's false, because no one is silencing anybody. You can say that people need to take responsibility for what they say. So somehow or other, we lost two slides. The next slide was supposed to be Kanye West and Kyrie Irving, the basketball player and the singer, whose anti-Semitic statements and refusal to take responsibility for their statements is what got them in trouble. They have the right to say anything, but we have the right to respond and to hold them responsible. And that is something that some of the opponents of IRA and some of the opponents, particularly of Israel, find very difficult to accept and to handle. The last slide that I was going to show was actually a slide of a picture of all the 11 victims of the Tree of Life shooting in Pittsburgh. And I'm sorry that it's not there somehow, or that it got lost. But the reason why I wanted to end with that is that all these things have come together and have created an environment today where anti-Semitism, I think, is at its worst stage, certainly in the post-World War II era. And I actually think even before that in many ways. And I think that what we have to do about it is stand firm with tools like IRA, and not back down and not be afraid, and call on allies. And we have allies in the African American, the Black community, people like Tyler Perry, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. We have it in popular rock music at the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame induction the other day. John Mellencamp made a really strong statement against anti-Semitism. And we need to recognize that basically, I think that, and make sure that other people recognize that, in the words of the former UN rapporteur on freedom of religion and belief, Ahmed Shahid, that anti-Semitism is toxic to democracy. It's our struggle, but it has an impact for our entire society. So thank you for all your work and what you're doing to keep the memory alive of where anti-Semitism can lead and what we have to learn from it. And I hope that we can continue to work together and really come out in a better place from this. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. Obviously, you could go on much longer, and we appreciate you doing your best to give us an abbreviated history. Jonah Cohen will provide us with some practical responses for dealing with instances of anti-Semitic rhetoric. Jonah is Director of Communications For the Committee for Accuracy in Middle East Reporting and Analysis, better known as CAMERA. He holds first-class honors and PhD from the Department of Philosophy and Religions at the University of London. His essays on Jews, Israel, and human rights have appeared in numerous publications, including the New Republic, The Hill, Jerusalem Post, Times of Israel Commentary, Jewish News Syndicate, Real Clear Politics, and others. Please welcome Jonah Cohen.
Well, thanks so much, Dina, and thanks to everyone at the Generations After, everybody here today. It's an honor to be invited to speak to you, given all we've just heard from Mark's informative and very sobering presentation. The big question before us now is, well, what do we do about it? How do we resist this ancient evil, which just doesn't seem to stop hounding us? Now, I approach this question with a great deal of humility, especially in the context of an audience like you, whose families have suffered the very worst of anti-Semitism. And in light of the Elie Wiesel quote that Dina cited earlier, Wiesel was absolutely right. We don't know how to eradicate anti-Semitism. I certainly don't have a magic bullet. But in the next 25 minutes, I'm going to put forward some ideas, sketch some ideas for your consideration that may not eradicate the problem of anti-Semitism, but that can help, I hope, contain its virulence. So please take my remarks in the spirit of dialogue and not dogma or arrogance. I very much look forward to hearing your feedback and learning from your insights and family experiences in the Q&A section of today's program. Now, in my view, I don't think there is one method for combating anti-Semitism, for fighting back. And that's because there isn't one type of anti-Semitic action. The proper response for one form of anti-Semitism may not be the proper response for another type. For that reason, it's useful, I think, to begin classifying or trying to classify the various forms of anti-Semitic actions and then systematically analyze the best methods for fighting back depending on the circumstances. Now, to classify anti-Semitic actions, I'd say there are three big categories, each of which requires different kinds of responses from us. So in the slide, we see these three categories: one, street anti-Semitism; two, political anti-Semitism; three, social anti-Semitism. Now, today I'm going to focus mainly on the third category, social anti-Semitism, which I think is currently the most common form of anti-Semitism that people experience in the United States. But real quick, let me say something about the other two. By street anti-Semitism, I mean actions that pose a direct physical threat to you, bodily harm. For example, a synagogue shooting or a hostage situation. A salient symbol of the reality of street anti-Semitism is the ubiquitous image of the police car in front of Jewish houses of worship, something that you can see throughout Western nations from here to Denmark. Also in the category of street anti-Semitism is just ugly invective, crude insults. Some stranger, let's say, stops you on the street and starts calling you names, ethnic slurs about being Jewish, or starts berating you about Israel. Verbal intimidation of that kind, where there's just no semblance of intellectual discourse or respect for you as a rational human being. Now, how do we combat that? How do we combat street anti-Semitism? Well, when faced with this kind of brute animosity, where you're just a mere object in the way of an oncoming train, as it were, you have one overriding goal. And that goal, obviously, is to protect yourself and your loved ones physically and psychologically as best you can. This is a moment where you are not out to convert anyone or change the world into a better place. It's a realm of hell. You're in a hell realm with devils where you need to survive physically and spiritually. And depending on the circumstances, that means you have to choose, I think, between four options. You might literally need to fight, physically fight, or two, flee, run the other way, or three, hide, or four, if those options aren't available, fight, flee, or hide. If those options aren't available, you need to go somewhere inside yourself. You need to practice some kind of meditation or prayer or something that allows you to go to an inner place untouched by the external world, so that if you do come out, if you do come out alive from this horrible experience of street anti-Semitism, you're not irreparably scarred emotionally with some kind of PTSD that haunts you or your family for decades. Viktor Frankl's book, Man's Search for Meaning, is, I think, very good on this topic. So in the next category, it's political anti-Semitism. Here, I'm not only talking about governmental policies of various sorts. I'm talking about any institutional action that targets Jews or some fairly large segment of Jews as a collective. Political anti-Semitism can take the form of legal discrimination, of political messaging from political parties and politicians and candidates, of one-sided anti-Israel resolutions from student governments and universities, or a virulent professor in a college classroom who will mark you down if you don't parrot his political worldview, or boycott efforts, BDS, or biased portrayals of Jews in school textbooks and lesson plans, or biased journalism, which is what my organization, CAMRA, largely focuses on fighting. All of these are what I'm calling political anti-Semitism, these institutional efforts against Jews as a collective. Political anti-Semitism, in turn, requires from us collective action. It's fairly easy for a newspaper editor to ignore your individual letter of complaint about a biased anti-Jewish article. But if the editor receives 500 other articles of complaint too, it's a lot harder for the editor to ignore your concerns. So fighting political anti-Semitism means we need to reach out and connect with other Jews. And that, in many instances, requires us to support Jewish organizations that can galvanize the many talents within our community so that we can push back as a group. Fighting political anti-Semitism requires, it requires what we're doing here today, coming together, sharing ideas with the ultimate aim of defending our collective rights. And part of that, of course, includes keeping Jewish memory alive, which is what the generation after is doing and why it's so important. My daughter, for example, is about to have her bat mitzvah, and we're going to participate in this organization's Remember a Child program so that my daughter's coming of age ritual is forever connected with a child Shoah victim, keeping that memory alive, that flame alive, passing on this mission to the next generation. This institutionalized program is a fine example of one way to fight back against political anti-Semitism. And so it's absolutely critical that we find such ways to come together as a group. Now, saying that we need to work together might sound somewhat trite or cliche to some of you, but the sad truth is the Jewish community is not always united, and that weakens us. But when we are united, we can affect real change. I mean, think of how British Jews united to help stop the anti-Semitic politician Jeremy Corbyn from winning the 2019 general election, and how the British Labour Party is now having to deal with the Jewish community's collective unhappiness. Or remember how this year Jews in Boston, where I live, came together across political lines to denounce the anti-Semitic BDS mapping project, which targeted American Jewish civil society. It targeted a Jewish high school. So fighting back against political anti-Semitism requires us coming together and supporting Jewish institutions and organizations. We're a small people, and we need all hands on deck to push back against political anti-Semitism. So the last category of anti-Semitic action is what I call social anti-Semitism, And this is largely an individual experience. This is what happens to you when anti-Jewish and anti-Israel rhetoric gets expressed in your day-to-day life by friends and colleagues in social and professional situations, at the office, over lunch, at a dinner party, by people who may not even know that they're articulating hostile and bigoted and ignorant views about Jews, about Jewish history, about the Jewish nation state. This is anti-Semitism at its most subtle and sophisticated. It can be expressed by people with PhDs, by people who just don't meet our stereotype of the anti-Semite. Unlike street anti-Semitism, the motivation of social anti-Semitism is not simply to insult or humiliate, but to persuade, to convince you or others that Jews really are bad. Its goal then is not merely to attack, but to instruct, to teach. For example, at a cocktail party, someone might say what you see on your screen here. I think it's sad that the Israelis are now doing to the Palestinians what the Nazis did to the Jews. That statement, comparing Israeli policies to the atrocities of Nazi Germany, is a very common statement. I've heard it 1,000 times in my life. And as Mark just said, it falls within the IRA definition of anti-Semitism. Thanks. And so here's a cartoon making fun of this kind of social anti-Semitism. If you can't read it on your screen, it shows three people at a cocktail party. One of them has a Palestinian flag pin on his jacket, and he's saying, "Oh, I don't care about Palestinians. This pin lets me call Jews white supremacists, racists, and Nazis as much as I want." The point of the cartoon is to show how people use the Israeli-Palestinian conflict to vent their anti-Semitic feelings. So how should we fight back against this kind of camouflaged anti-Semitism in our social and professional lives? How should we respond when Jews or Israel get brought up in this way, in this very negative, one-sided way in our day-to-day life? Is there a method? Is there a method to engage people that isn't confrontational or awkward or tense? In other words, that befits a social or professional situation, so that you don't come across as pushy, uptight, defensive, unpleasant, but more importantly, so you don't go home feeling embarrassed or weak or trampled upon or ashamed of how you carried yourself. Most people's instinctual response to social anti-Semitism is, I think, to go into a kind of debate mode. That is, when someone makes a hostile or controversial statement about Jews or Israel over the dinner table, we tend to assume that what's called for is the kind of response one gives in a debate, like in school. We think we need to immediately offer a counterclaim. That is, we immediately have to assert that Israel is not like Nazi Germany and the Palestinians are not suffering a genocide, which is all true, of course. But instead of that kind of response with a declarative sentence, what I've been proposing lately is a questioning method, I call it the gadfly method, named after Socrates, the ancient Greek philosopher who used to call himself a gadfly because he would buzz about Athens challenging people with questions. Greg Koukl, a Christian philosopher, calls it the Columbo tactic, named after the 1970s TV detective. But whatever you want to call this questioning approach, it's a powerful method for fighting back against social anti-Semitism because it doesn't accept the anti-Semitic assumption that we Jews are on trial. Rather, this questioning approach keeps the rhetorical heat on the anti-Semite who in fact has the burden of proof because he or she is the one making the claims in the conversation. The person who makes the claim bears the burden of proof. It's their responsibility to back up what they say and prove that it's true. And so the gadfly method proceeds through questioning, through testing the consistency of someone's moral principles and assumptions, through trapping them in contradictions in their own statements or just exposing their ignorance. And that's what the gadfly method provides. It's a series of 3 questions that keeps the burden of proof on the anti-Semite and entangles him in his or her words. And yet it does it in a graceful and inoffensive way, in a way that befits a social or professional situation. And to begin this method, you always start with a very simple question about the meaning of someone's terms. It's the same question which Socrates almost always first asked in his conversations. And that question is this: what do you mean by that? What do you mean by X? So your first move in this conversational game plan is just to request information about the meaning of the other person's terms, the meaning of the other person's terms. So as you listen to someone attacking Israel or Jews, you suppress your instinct to make a counterclaim and instead pick one area in their speech to plant the first gadfly question, the what do you mean by that question. For example, if someone at the dinner table compares Israel to Nazi Germany, you'll ask him, what do you mean it's like Nazi Germany? Or are you saying Israel's committing genocide? What do you mean by genocide? In this conversational strategy, then you never assume the person at the table truly understands the meaning of his or her words and how they apply or don't apply to Jews or Israel. Always ask, what do you mean by that? Because many of the terms that are typically used to vilify Jews or Israel in conversations are ambiguous, even deliberately misleading at times. The anti-Semite frequently employs emotive words like genocide in non-standard ways, which can lead to substantial confusion if you don't pause him in his tracks and clear up his meanings. Anything, for example, can be called genocide if you change the definition of genocide. But as I often say, even if one doesn't know much about Nazi Germany or genocide or whatever other idea the person is using against Jews or Israel, one can still ask this question. At this point in the gadfly method, you're just gathering information, and anybody can do that. Anybody of whatever range of knowledge can ask, what do you mean by that term? And once the person clears up what they mean, if they can, and often they cannot, often all you have to do to stop them in their ugly rhetoric is ask for the meaning of their words, and they get all tripped up. But once they answer that first question, however badly, you then move on to ask the second question of the gadfly method. The second gadfly question is this: what are your reasons for thinking that's true? What are your reasons for thinking that's true? What are your reasons for saying Israel is committing genocide? That's the second question in this strategy, or some variation of it, such as, how did you reach that conclusion? Why do you think that's the way it is? What's the evidence for your interpretation? Can you explain to me why your view is more plausible than other views? Can you give me the reasons for the opposing view? Now, the power of this kind of question is that it emphasizes, it underlines who actually has the burden of proof in a conversation. And that's always the person making the claims. It's their job to back up what they say. It's not your job to prove them wrong. They need to do all the thinking and explaining, not you. But in such circumstances, almost all of us instinctually feel it's our job to step forward and give all the reasons why Jews in Israel are good. We think the burden is on us. And that's exactly what the anti-Semite wants from you. He wants to put Jews on the defensive, to place the burden of proof on us. It's a rhetorical ploy. Don't buy into it. Don't play along. When you do, you let the anti-Semite off the hook. He gets to spit out an anti-Israel or anti-Semitic claim, then sit back and fold his arms while you try to prove him wrong, and he takes swipes at your effort. That's a terrible strategy of conversational engagement with such a malign person. He's tricked you. He's tricked you into assuming the burden of proof, all because you failed to hold him to account for his own claim. You don't have the burden of proof. So by asking some version of this question, you're not letting the anti-Semite have a free ride to make allegations about Jews or Israel. You're not letting him or her simply tell a story without providing reasons for that view. And as you listen to someone explain their story about why they think Israel or Jews are bad, be asking yourself whether their story is possible or plausible or probable given the evidence. Ask yourself whether it's the best explanation considering the competing options. Just because his genocide story might be possible, it doesn't mean his story is true or likely. If he explains, for example, that Israel is genocidal by pointing to, say, the fact that more Palestinians have died than Israelis in their various wars, then he's giving you a story, a possible explanation about the nature of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. It's not an argument. It's a possibility. It's an assumption. It may be a correct assumption, but it's an assumption. It needs argument. It needs evidence to show it's the more plausible or probable explanation than other possible explanations for the casualty figures of that conflict. Suppose then you do detect problems in his genocide story. For instance, you want to challenge his genocide theory by bringing in the fact that the Palestinian population has been growing for decades, something that doesn't happen under conditions of real genocide, or the fact that that Palestinian life expectancy is the same or higher than the global average, also something that doesn't happen under conditions of real genocide. Or the fact that the casualty figures of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, however tragic, are really quite meager in comparison to other wars in the world. And so you also want to get your own ideas into the conversation, ideas like these. Here is where the third gadfly question comes in. It's the last question in the game plan, and it's not really one question, but a set of probing leading questions. Leading questions are a different sort of question than the first two questions. Up till now in the strategy, you'll have only asked questions that gather information about a person's meaning and his reasons for holding them. But with the third gadfly question, you go on the counterattack, exposing flaws, double standards, omissions, unconventional definitions in the conversation. These questions lead your conversational partner, or at least those overhearing the conversation, to see that the anti-Semite's claims are contradictory, or that they're ignoring relevant information. In these types of questions, your ideas are inserted into the question itself. Wouldn't you agree that if the Palestinian population has been growing for decades, then it's wrong to say Israel is committing genocide? Doesn't your view leave out the data of rising Palestinian life expectancy? How does your claim square with the fact that life expectancy falls in cases of genocide? If Israel were like Nazi Germany, wouldn't we see death camps? The beauty of leading questions is you keep the burden of proof on the other person while also sharing your own ideas, your own claims in the conversation. And that in brief is the gadfly method for fighting back against social anti-Semitism. 3 types of questions. What do you mean by that? What are your reasons for thinking that's true? And as you listen to their reasons, you ask yourself, is their story possible, plausible, or probable, given the evidence and competing theories? And then finally, leading questions such as, how does what you say square with this other important fact? At what cost? Wouldn't your proposal result in these bad outcomes? Compared to what? Wouldn't you agree that such and such is true? Then how come you say so and so is also true? Asking these types of questions makes you inquisitive rather than pushy or argumentative. And they keep you in control of the conversation while the other guy is shouldering the burden of proof. Once you get into the habit of asking them, you'll be able to converse about Israel and Jews with just about anybody. So I recommend that you try this gadfly method whenever you have the misfortune of experiencing social anti-Semitism. Many people have told me that it's been a real game changer for them. It's a powerful way to fight back in social and professional situations. And today, I've only really skimmed over the gadfly approach. There's much more to be said about it. And if you're interested to hear more about it, I'll be giving an 1.5-hour webinar about the technique for camera on November 13th at 8 p.m. Eastern, and also on November 17th at 1 p.m. Eastern. If you'd like to attend, just please email Dina your name and email, and I'll make sure you're signed up. Okay, so if we go to the last slide, I'll sum up. In this talk, I identified 3 big categories of anti-Semitic action: street anti-Semitism, political anti-Semitism, and social anti-Semitism. To combat street anti-Semitism, I suggested that we have about 4 options: fight, flee, hide, or go inward, a spiritual practice of some kind like meditation or prayer. To combat political anti-Semitism, I suggested we need to support and participate in Jewish institutions, such as what you're doing with the generations after, and recruit others to join us. And then finally, to combat social anti-Semitism, I briefly outlined the gadfly method. Like Elie Wiesel said, these approaches probably won't eradicate anti-Semitism, but they might help us keep it at bay so that we can continue to live and love and enjoy our lives as Jews as much as possible in this often heartbreaking world. So I leave these thoughts for your reflection. If anything I said was useful, please take it, and that which wasn't helpful to you, just leave aside. Thank you, and thanks for listening, everybody.
Thank you so much, Jonah. Certainly gave us all a lot to think about. Now, Susan Kent-Objian, a member of our program committee, will handle the Q&A section of our program. Please continue writing your questions in the chat, and we will get to as many as we can. Susan?
Okay, thank you, as Dina said, and please, we have some questions, and I'm going to first ask this. Well, it actually goes to both Jonah and Mark. The question came in: if we want to combat anti-Semitism, fear, or irrational hate of Jews, why shouldn't we ask, why are so many fearing so few? Merely 2% of our US population, and even fewer worldwide. I would guess, Jonah, that might fall into the leading question at the end of the gadfly method. And if not, please, share with us how you would view that.
Mark, do you want to take this? I'm not sure I fully followed the question.
I think if I understand properly, the question is that why does anti-Semitism exist to the extent that it does, given the relative size of the Jewish population versus the non-Jewish population? What threat could we possibly present, and that kind of thing. So I'm going to say I've tried to give a sense of that there are historical roots to anti-Semitism. And what I didn't say, or maybe I didn't spell out, but I'll say it now, is we often hear the word structural thrown around these days. Anti-Semitism is structural in Western civilization. It's part of what was built into it, because even though For example, both the Protestant and Catholic churches have formally rejected anti-Semitism, Nostra Aetate, the famous Vatican document, and all that. There still exists both images, texts, and people in positions who don't want to accept these. I mean, we see all over arguments and struggles against modernity, against liberal, and I don't mean liberal political, I'm talking about liberal social, the broad extent of Western liberal civilization. And we see people trying to turn the clock back, trying to revert to a ruling ideology, a dominating ideology that is pre-World War II instead of post-World War II. And anti-Semitism was strong then and has maintained a strong and vigorous and active presence, and has now been emboldened and brought out, and where it once was marginalized, it's become perhaps a political tool to be embraced by certain significant actors. And what I'll say here in terms of that as well is one of the things that I've been arguing for years, but certainly more so in the last few years, is that we cannot allow anti-Semitism to be weaponized for political purposes. Meaning anti-Semitism, if it's, if you're going to denounce it, let me put it this way, if you're going to denounce it and you're on the left, then you have to begin by denouncing anti-Semitism on the left first. If you're going to denounce it and you're on the right, then you have to begin by looking at your own house and denouncing it from the right. If you're on the right and point to anti-Semitism on the left, if you're on the left and point to it on the right only, then you're playing political football. Then it's a tool. Because you have other aspects of your agenda that you're prioritizing over anti-Semitism. To deal with it seriously means you have to look inward at your own, ideology, political persuasion, party, however you will, and to begin to deal with it. And that also means in terms of if you're in sports, if you're in journalism, the same thing. Calling out other figures while being silent when someone is in your field spouting anti-Semitism. You got to start by walking the walk, and that's got to take place with the people that you're dealing with and have influence or impact on first. Anything else is kind of not so serious in an approach to it.
I agree entirely with that. One thing that leaves me often uncomfortable about discussions of anti-Semitism is the notion that it's just hatred. I think the emotion of hatred, of course, is there, but as Mark's saying, it's an ideology, it's a worldview, and so we need to start looking at the assumptions and the terms they're using, and that's why in social anti-Semitism, I think it's very important to go after the meaning of their words, because it is an ideology, it is a worldview, and we need to philosophically attack it.
So you have shown, Jonah, that the Gatsline method is from way back when, right?
Yeah.
Periods past. How did you determine to use it? And has there been any kind of studies that show that it works? Has it been compared to outcome-based reflections?
Yeah, so I came upon it after many conversational failures of my own, and applying different models to these conversations. One model, I think, which is our natural instinct, is to go into debate mode. We kind of imagine two people standing at podiums debating. That's one model. Another model we often assume is what I call the teacher model, where we immediately think our response should look like a teacher's lecture. But both models, in my personal experience, never really worked that well. And then, I grew up, my background is in philosophy. I grew up reading Plato. So I started thinking, well, why not use that method of questioning? And I found that in my own life, it really changed the game for me. And then for others who have been applying it, they've told me it's worked for them. But right now, they're just kind of anecdotal stories as for its effectiveness.
Okay. And for Mark, knowing what you know now about how the IRA definition of anti-Semitism has been both attacked and supported, do you feel like it needs to be amended in any way? Or do you think that, as you explained, that it's sufficient in what its purpose is?
I don't think sufficient is the right word to put it that way. Politically, we're not going to amend it at all or change it because I don't know if I feel like going through the process of getting 35 countries to unanimously sign on to it again. That was a draining process. And I think that the fact that it has been adopted so much shows that it really, came at a time when there was a need for something like that, and it's filled that need. And I think it's proven that that of its value by the reception that it's gotten. I will say that those 11 examples, which are particularly the ones that the examples are the ones that seem to create the most controversy, were never meant to be a total list of all the aspects of anti-Semitism. I could point out aspects of it that weren't included. I could, that we could have added if we were doing it today. But I think they were just examples. They were there to show the kind of things that we're talking about and to spur people to recognize that anti-Semitism exists in both older forms and newer forms. That it is not static. It is not, what happened 80 years ago does not necessarily happen the same way today. It was Chief Rabbi Sachs who described it as a virus that mutates. So there are different strains of it, some more modern, some of, come in reaction to efforts and vaccinations against it. But it's an ongoing problem and an ongoing process that we have to constantly be alert to the way it's appearing. And Ira points the way by saying that there is no one, rigid example, that it's fluid. And these are pictures, illustrations, examples that you can use to sort of see where it goes, and you may have to come up with different ones as the case may be. But that doesn't mean that you have to go back and change the original the original text at all.
We're going to take one or two more questions. One came in that said, if you sent someone to trying to use gadfly method back on you, how should one respond?
Yeah, that's a great question. So you should be aware that people do know the technique, people on the other side, and they will use it against you. My strategy when that I always try and get the other person making the claim so that they have the burden of proof. So if they're asking me questions and I'm getting suspicious, I will tend to say something like, "It sounds like you're trying to make a statement. I'm not really following you. Can you tell me in your own words what you're saying?" And that way, once they get to make the claim, then I can reverse it, and then I have the gadfly method on my side.
Okay. And I'm going to tie a couple questions. Has to do with the church. Two kind of part is the church still fostering the anti-Semitic sentiment of the years past, and also with the rise of evangelicals and their commitment to Israel through tourism, trying to keep Israel alive while waiting for the second coming of Jesus. How do we deal with all these things with this, the involvement still of the church?
Right. If you mean church, you mean Christendom in general, or the Catholic Church? Because the Catholic Church is officially partnered with the Jewish community in condemning anti-Semitism, fighting anti-Semitism. The document Nostra Aetate from 65 was just an initial step. There have been a series of other documents and a series of teachings and work that is ongoing on this. But there is, and I published something on this a few years ago, there is a strong body of radical traditionalist Catholic, and I want to be very clear here. I'm not talking about the people who want, let's say, the Latin Mass. That's their religious choice, and I have nothing to say about that. But these are people who reject modernity, are Holocaust deniers, are anti-Semites, and want to restore anti-Semitism as a platform. And they're allied with some parts of the American extremist political scene, including, for example, Ron Paul was circulating in those circles as well. And these are people who have embraced the traditional and keep alive the traditional anti-Semitism of the pre-Vatican II Catholic Church. So there is that strain, and I think everyone is on guard against it, and they are, in some ways more powerful politically than they are theologically, but it's there. There's no question that it's there. In terms of the evangelical community, I think there is anti-Semitism in the evangelical community. There's also studies that show that the younger generation of evangelicals are not as committed to support of Israel as the older generation are. So we may be seeing a bit of a shift there that's could be problematic. I think there's also a tendency among even those who are friendly to Israel to view Israel and Jews as actors in their drama. Jews are not necessarily actors in our own drama. We play a role for them. And that's why they sometimes can be very strongly supportive of Israel, while at the same time being not so supportive or friendly of Jewish interests outside of that particular subject. I think that in terms of a Jewish community, we need to be open to working with everybody, but at the same time to recognizing that there are lines that we can't cross, and to recognize as well that the goal of education, of opening people's minds to the reality that Jews, we have our own existence, we have our own definition, we have our own idea of what the role that we want to play in the world is, how we want to live our own lives, and we're the only ones that can affirm that and take responsibility for ourselves.
Thank you very much. And I think, Shelley, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Great. Thank you, Susan, for fielding those questions. My name is Shelley Klein. I'm co-chair of the Generations After Program Committee, as well as a board member. On behalf of all of us, Mark and Jonah, I want to thank you so much for your insights today. During this very unsettling period of rising anti-Semitism, the information that you've given us today is indeed timely and most important, both in helping us trace the evolution of anti-Semitism and understanding what we as individuals can do to combat it as well as we can. So I thank you very, very much. Just a reminder that to our audience that we will hold our Generations After annual meeting and elections immediately following this meeting. In the meantime, though, I'd like to tell you all that everyone who registered for the program will receive a link to the recording on our YouTube channel within a few days. And you will also receive a short survey by email. We'd be most appreciative if you'd complete it to aid us in developing future programs. Before I go any further, I do want to continue my thanks, in addition to Mark and Jonah, to our technical consultant, Ephraim Katzir, to the entire program committee, to my co-chair, Ruth Cummings, and the rest of the committee members whose names you see on screen, Micheline, Susan, Anat, Dina, Susan, Rachel, thank you all so much. Please do visit our website at www.generationsafter.com. I also wanted to mention, if you are a current member, thank you. If you would like to become a member, please join. And if you would like to make a one-time donation for this free program, we would, of course, gladly accept that. And again, please feel free to visit our website at genafterdc.com to learn more. And check our monthly newsletter for news about our January 2023 program. On behalf of the program committee and the Generations After, thank you all so much for joining us today. And now I'm going to turn the program over to Dina Hirsch, our Vice President and Acting President, actually, of the Generations After, for our annual meeting and elections. Thank you all so much.